Hey guys, welcome back. If you've ever found yourself wondering how it was even possible that Númenor could fall from the height of bliss and nobility down to the uttermost depths of squalid decay, this is the video for you. Renowned in its early years for both its power and its virtue, the island realm of Númenor dominates the history of the Second Age of Middle-earth. Over the centuries, its people and rulers become cruel and arrogant, until finally its fleets dare to sail against the Blessed Realm. In response, Eru himself wipes the island off the face of the earth, and only a handful of refugees survive the disaster. It should come as no surprise that the immediate cause of this catastrophe is Sauron. When challenged in his own realm by Ar-Pharazôn, Númenor's 25th and final king, Sauron allows himself to be captured and brought back to Númenor. There, he plays on Pharazôn's pride and fear until he has convinced the king, and most of the rest of the kingdom, to openly rebel against the laws of the Valar and take Morgoth as their lord instead. Although Sauron's capture occurs at the peak of Númenor's military and economic power, the histories make clear that by that point its society had been deteriorating for generations. Apart from a few pockets of the faithful, Númenor's populace had already largely abandoned the wisdom of their forebears, rejected their ties to elvish culture, and begun to prey on their fellow men. And rather than departing the world with dignity, its kings clung ever more desperately to life and power. The first recorded signs of this so-called shadow are noticed around the time of Tar Ciryatan, Númenor's 12th ruler. Some of these alarming developments include the construction of permanent defended colonies on other shores, more resources being imported from Middle-earth, and the first denunciations of the Valar's ban against westward expeditions. Ciryatan's predecessor and father, Tar Minastir, was known for his love of the Eldar, and is remembered for sending a fleet to the aid of Lindon during the War of the Elves and Sauron. And those who came before Minastir are generally considered to have ruled over a civilization of unparalleled wisdom and righteousness. So at first it seems that Ciryatan must have been the first really bad apple to take the throne, and perhaps Númenor's devolution was caused by a simple stroke of bad luck, the wrong person taking power at the wrong time. But close review of what fragments of knowledge we have reveals a more complex reality. Centuries before the shadow over Númenor was recognized, there were subtle but unmistakable signs that not all was well in the Land of Gift. Between Númenor's founding and the start of its corruption, little is recorded, seemingly because there's little to tell. After the Valar lift the island of Númenor out of the sea at the start of the Second Age, Elros Tar Miniatur, the son of Eärendil and brother of Elrond, leads the surviving Edain across the sea, where they set about founding a civilization. Though he's already chosen the fate of men for himself and his descendants, Elros still has an extraordinarily long lifespan. He rules for 410 years, long enough that by the time he resigns the scepter, his son and heir Vardamir is also pretty advanced in years, and immediately hands the reins over to his son Amandil. Since analysts and genealogists hate this kind of malarkey, Vardamir is still noted as the honorary second king of Númenor, and assigned a reign of 1 year. Amandil rules for a century and a half without further notable incident, and his son, Tar Elendil, no, not that Elendil, mostly does likewise, with the exception of a seemingly benign development. In the year 600, for the first time, ships return from Númenor to the shores of Middle-earth. At the time, this seems to be a positive development, for most of the men of that age that sat under the shadow were now grown weak and fearful, and coming among them, the Númenorians taught them many things. Then the men of Middle-earth were comforted, and here and there upon the western shores the houseless woods drew back, and men shook off the yoke of the offspring of Morgoth, and unlearned their terror of the dark. But the issue of communication between Númenor and Middle-earth soon creates political and personal problems for Elendil's heir, Tar Mineldur. While he is considered a just and wise king overall, the story of his reign and that of his son Aldarion, recorded in some detail in the tale of the Mariner's Wife, demonstrates that even in this period of supposed bliss, all kinds of latent problems were already roiling under the surface. Meneldur marries Almarion, whose father Veantor led that first fateful expedition to Middle-earth. Their son Aldarion inherits his maternal grandfather's wanderlust and from an early age loves shipbuilding, sailing, and exploration. In voyages that take him everywhere from Umbar to Lindon, he learns much of the men and elves of Middle-earth, their customs and languages, the difficult conditions they continue to face, and the unnerving rumors of an unknown, sinister presence that survived the fall of Morgoth centuries ago. Driven by these legitimate concerns, along with his adventurous spirit and eventually a desire to escape his marital issues, Aldarion aims to expand Númenor's fleet and strengthen its ties to other lands. He creates the Guild of Venturers to further these aims with other like-minded men. Despite his best efforts at commercial forestry, Aldarion sees that Númenor's native supply of timber will always be limited, but the forested expanses of Middle-earth offer a way to support the construction of more and larger ocean-going ships. While at this point no Númenorians are settling permanently in Middle-earth, Aldarion starts building havens on its coasts to facilitate longer voyages. Meneldur is not entirely opposed to Aldarion's designs, at least at first, but as time progresses, he fears Aldarion is neglecting his domestic duties, both to Númenor and to Erendis, his long-suffering girlfriend and eventually his neglected and estranged wife. Not only does Erendis lack sympathy with Aldarion's sea longing, she is also rather more constrained by her mortality than he is. As Meneldur warns his son, "You take your grace for granted. Erendis has shorter hope than you, and her years wane swifter. She is not of the line of Elros, and she has loved you now many years." Aldarion, though, resents what he sees as his father's meddling, and continues his voyaging in open defiance of his father's wishes. In turn, Meneldur repeatedly seeks to set limits on shipbuilding and navigation, which raises eyebrows among his subjects, particularly the small but influential Guild of Venturers. On the other hand, people aren't terribly impressed with Aldarion's scandalously cavalier treatment of Erendis either. It's tempting to blame these tensions solely on Aldarion's restlessness, but as Meneldur learns, the situation is more complicated than that. In 882, Aldarion returns from yet another long voyage with a letter from no less than High King Gil-galad, thanking Meneldur profusely for the invaluable assistance his son has provided, and asking for Númenor's aid against a growing darkness that he says will one day threaten not only Middle-earth, but Númenor itself. It's worth remembering that Meneldur is really the first king in Númenor's history for whom foreign policy even exists, and he does not take this duty lightly. I am in too great doubt to rule, to prepare or to let be, to prepare for war which is yet only guessed, train craftsmen and tillers in the midst of peace for blood-spilling and battle, put iron in the hands of greedy captains who will love only conquest and count the slain as their glory, or to fold hands while friends die unjustly, let men live in blind peace until the ravisher is at the gate, when either way may lead to evil. Of what worth is choice? To Meneldur's credit, he recognizes he is not up to this challenge, and whatever disagreements lie between them, Aldarion's extensive travels make him the better man for the job. Although he still has plenty of vigorous years ahead of him, Meneldur therefore reconciles with his son and passes on the scepter early. As king, Aldarion mostly continues the policies he started pursuing earlier in life. He maintains the Númenorian ports on Middle-earth's coasts, oversees the harvest of timber from the forests south of Lindon, and furthers his relations with the Eldar. He also largely continues to neglect domestic affairs. While this doesn't appear to have much of an immediate effect on the nation, it spells disaster for Aldarion's personal life. He and Erendis become permanently estranged. Their daughter and only child, Ancalime, is at first raised in near isolation by her mother, who teaches her to distrust all males as a matter of principle. Unfortunately, when it comes to monarchies, the personal is always political. Up to this point, the rule of Númenor had traditionally been passed down from father to eldest male child, and since all the preceding kings have had at least one son, the custom has never been called into question until now. For what Tolkien noted are reasons of private concern rather than policy, Aldarion makes a law expressly allowing him to name Ancalime his heir, giving him a claim on his daughter's time and attention that Erendis cannot prevent. the exact nature of the laws Aldarion introduces vary depending on the source, and seem to have undergone changes even during his lifetime, but in any case their effects reach far beyond Ancalime's status. With inheritance through the female line now considered viable, entire branches of the royal family suddenly find themselves in line for the throne, while others are now bumped from the queue. On top of that, Aldarion's council is quite insistent that Ancalime's position should depend on her getting married, and Aldarion stipulates that the king's heir should only marry within the line of Elros. It is said that this ordinance arose directly from Aldarion's disastrous marriage to Erendis and his reflections upon it, for she had a lesser lifespan and he believed that therein lay the root of all their troubles. These restrictions prove unfortunate for Ancalime, as they make her marriage more a political affair than a private one. She eventually bows to pressure and marries Halakar, a particularly persistent and ingenious specimen of the swarm of suitors now vying for her attention. Their marriage does succeed in producing a son and securing the succession, but unsurprisingly, it is not a happy match. And since members of the line of Elros are now considered the only fitting candidates for royal marriage, the noble class of Númenor will increasingly be determined from descent rather than merit in the centuries to come. Aldarion, though, could hardly care less about the chaos this law might cause in some distant hypothetical future. In addition to scoring a major win over his wife, by naming Ancalime his heir, he can more easily pursue his adventures abroad. As king, he continues to undertake long voyages around the coasts of Middle-earth, leaving Ancalime as his regent. Though they have yet to make permanent settlements on Middle-earth, there are enough Númenorians active along the coasts at the turn of the millennium to unnerve Sauron. His concerns drive him to take up residence in Mordor, a development we're told that the Númenorians eventually reported to Gil-galad despite Sauron's efforts to avoid detection. His occupation of Mordor he no doubt would have kept secret if he could, but the Númenorians occupying the mouths of Anduin and the shorelands of Lebanon had discovered his devices and revealed them to Gil-galad. In the end, even Aldarion can't sail around forever. He eventually returns from his final voyage, and in 1075 the scepter passes to Ancalime. Until her father's death in 1098, Ancalime takes his advice on matters concerning Middle-earth, but after his passing, she loses interest in foreign affairs and lets the havens he worked so hard to maintain fall into ruin. Around a century after Aldarion's death, once he could be sure the coast was indeed clear, Sauron sets about infiltrating the northern realms of the Eldar under an assumed identity. Gil-galad is alarmed by the appearance of an unnervingly beautiful stranger seeking entrance to his realm. But despite his foresighted attempts to secure Númenor's friendship, he finds no support or aid is forthcoming. Turned away from Lindon's borders, Anatar slouches away eastward, and for the next 4 centuries, as Eregion thrives under the guidance of its new guest, there's little Gil-galad and Elrond can do but watch and wait. After Aldarion, the records of the Númenorian kings and queens again become fragmentary, vague, and rife with discrepancies and contradictions, but they still illustrate the important trends of the time. Ancalime rules for a whopping 205 years, in part it seems because Númenorian women tend to live even longer than its men. In 1280, a mere 5 years before her death, she steps aside in favor of her heir and only child Anarion. His reign seems to have been fairly uneventful, but it was not entirely without incident. For one thing, Anarion had 3 children, and the elder 2 were daughters. According to the law his grandfather passed, their rights to be named Anarion's heir should take precedence over his sons. Except Ancalime has apparently set such a toxic example that neither woman will accept the position. They disliked and feared the queen and refused the heirship, remaining unwed since the queen would not, in revenge, allow them to marry. Therefore, it's Anarion's youngest son, Surion, who eventually succeeds him. Appendix B to The Lord of the Rings offers the brief but tantalizing note that the first permanent Númenorian havens were constructed around 1200. This would have been toward the latter half of Ancalime's reign, and would therefore seem to contradict what is said about her neglecting any efforts to forge stronger ties with Middle-earth. But Númenorian longevity has a distorting effect on the historical record. Over the centuries that a ruler might hold power, not only their children but their grandchildren would grow to maturity and undertake their own projects. Given Ancalime's reported disinterest, it may have been Anarion or one of his children who approved, and maybe even initiated, the revival of Aldarion's projects. Unlike her aunts, Tarsurion's eldest child, Telperion, is interested in claiming the scepter, though she follows in her great-grandmother's footsteps by scorning marriage. During her reign, Sauron forges the ruling ring, lays waste to Eregion, and steadily marches westward across Eriador until the sudden arrival of a great fleet from Númenor decisively turns the tide. At this point, we run into another potential problem of chronology, for the Tale of Years in Appendix B to The Lord of the Rings states that Tar Minastir sends a great navy from Númenor to Lindon in the year 1700. Yet in The Line of Elros, appended to Aldarion and Arendis, Telperion is said to have ruled until 1731. The date is remarked upon because, unlike her predecessors, who allowed their heirs to succeed them while many years of health and vigor still lay before them, Telperion refuses to abdicate until mere months before her death later that same year. One way I've often seen people resolve this is by proposing that Minastir, Telperion's nephew and heir, was responsible for sending the fleet in the capacity of some role he held under Telperion, and where the records identify him as Tar Minastir, that is, with his royal prefix, it's merely a reference to the fact that he would indeed be the king, eventually. Combined with what is said of Telperion's clinging to life and power beyond what was customary, it's even tempting to imagine Minastir as something like the unofficial regent during the last years of her reign. Regardless of the exact title he held at the time, Minastir's decision to bring the might of Númenor's navy to bear against Sauron is acclaimed by the inhabitants of Middle-earth, especially the elves, who otherwise would almost certainly have been conquered. But Minastir's friendship with the elves seems to have been less wholesome than could be wished. He loved the Eldar, but envied them. Like Meneldur, he is known for building a high tower, but while Meneldur used his to study the heavens, Minastir would spend the great part of his days gazing westward. An uncomfortably prescient habit, given the circumstances of Númenor's ultimate end. Minastir's occidental pining reflects a trend that's been growing throughout the whole island for centuries. The Númenorians had now become great mariners, exploring all the seas eastward, and they began to yearn for the west and the forbidden waters. And the more joyful was their life, the more they began to long for the immortality of the Eldar. Minastir's son and heir, Ciryatan, in contrast, more closely resembles Aldarion. Impatient and proud, he rejects his father's westward fixations and instead eases his restlessness from a young age with voyages to the east, north, and south. Born in 1634, he would have witnessed and possibly even participated in Sauron's defeat. He inherits the throne in 1869, and it is said he constrained Minastir to step down before he wanted to. As I mentioned at the start of this video, the records note that many of the more overtly concerning trends heralding Númenor's decline emerged during Ciryatan's tenure. Númenor becomes more heavily involved with Middle-earth, leveraging their superior technology to exploit the mainland's resources. The people of Númenor begin to voice resentment of the Valar, and Ciryatan, as well as his son and successor Tar Atanamir, are increasingly distrustful of the Valar and the elves. But none of these developments are without precedent, and their root causes stem back to events that took place centuries before. During the 1800s, after helping chase Sauron all the way back to Mordor with only a fragment of his forces, the Númenorians began turning their ports into permanent and eventually fortified settlements. Appendix A describes the impact of this shift. At first, the Númenorians had come to Middle-earth as teachers and friends of lesser men afflicted by Sauron, but now their havens became fortresses, holding wide coastlands in subjection. Ciryatan seems to have been a proponent of such policies. He was a mighty king, but greedy of wealth. He built a great fleet of royal ships, and his servants brought back great store of metals and gems, and oppressed the men of Middle-earth. The histories list this as yet another portent of doom, pointing to the rapacity of Ciryatan's successors. But at the time, the arguments in favor of Númenor strengthening its position were compelling ones. After all, the lack of involvement and preparation in the preceding centuries had nearly resulted in Sauron's total victory. As it was, Minas Tirith's fleet had only arrived in the very nick of time and after significant delay. Taking a more proactive approach, of course, will require more ships and armaments. And as an island nation with limited arable land and a singular lack of mineral resources, Númenor must source the necessary timber and ore from elsewhere. They also need to defend access to these resources because the Númenorians find that, for a number of reasons, many of Middle-earth's inhabitants who they had once sought in friendship are no longer quite as welcoming as before. It was indeed their grievance when the shadow crept along the coasts and men whom they had befriended became afraid or hostile, that iron was used against them by those to whom they had revealed it. So as unfortunate as this arrangement will later prove to be, for all involved, it's also easy to see how it's at least partly a response to the erratic mismanagement of prior regimes. While Ciryatan may be the first example of a king who pressured his father into surrendering the throne against his wishes, the question of succession, and the circumstances and timing thereof, has been a source of drama for generations at this point. Whether it be Ancalime's marital woes, her granddaughter's refusal to be named heirs even at the risk of involuntary celibacy, or Telperion overstaying her welcome, Númenor's royal family has been using some fairly Machiavellian tactics to acquire and keep power at least since the days of Aldarion. And while the Númenorians may not have articulated their dissatisfaction over the ban of the Valar until now, this too has been brewing for centuries, as even the most temperate and faithful rulers of Númenor have suffered torment over their longing for the westward shores that they can see, but are not allowed to approach. Maybe it was even Ciryatan's personal indifference toward the Forbidden West that encouraged Númenor's citizens to break the long-standing taboo around expressing the anguish and frustration that they had long borne in silence. The history of Númenor, as recounted by the survivors of its destruction, reveals mixed feelings about their lost homeland. Their reverence for the great kings of the distant past, and their condemnation of the policies that ultimately led to the island's corruption, are both justified. Given the brevity of the records they left, however, these competing emotions may contribute to something of a false distinction between the so-called good kings and their depraved successors. The signs of civilizational decay may have been first noticed during the time of Ciryatan and Autonomir, but none of these developments were sudden or random. Rather, they were natural and perhaps inevitable products of centuries of history. Many even resulted directly from the decisions of Númenor's early rulers, who for all their wisdom and blessedness, proved to be only human in the end. If you enjoyed this look at good people forced to make bad choices, strike the like button with all the force of a Númenorian axe hitting the bole of a tree in the soon-to-be forest of Minhiriath. If you'd like to hear more about talking swords, magic jewels, generational trauma as an ineluctable force of moral and social degeneracy, and other storytelling devices that Tolkien seemed to favor, you can follow the link below to my Patreon page for bonus content, questionable memes, and access to the channel's Discord server. Thank you to everyone for watching, and particular thanks to my Patreon supporters, including Emperor Cain, Uwu Iluvatar, Seven-Eyed, Rico Mariani, Perhyle the Gardener, Amar, Catherine Berry, Dr. Newton Wen, Steve B., John H. Austin Jr., James A. McCormick, Nick Rialo, Jeremy Buckingham, Dorwin Gray, Zach Burns, Brendan Mooney, E. Rose B., Allison Kreutzberg, and Joel Bion.